The Middle Ages designates the time span roughly from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance and Reformation. The adjective medieval came from Latin medium as middle and aevum as age, refers to whatever was made, written, or thought during the Middle Ages. The Renaissance was to named by 19th historians and critics because they associated it with an outburst of creativity attributed to a rebirth or revival of Latin and especially of Greek learning and literature. The word Reformation designates the powerful religious movement that began in the early 16th century and repudiated the supreme authority of the Roman Catholic Church. The Renaissance was seen as spreading from Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries to the rest of Europe, whereas the Reformation began in Germany and quickly affected all Europe to a greater or lesser degree. The very idea of a renaissance or rebirth, however, implies something dormant or lacking in the preceding era. More recently, there have been two non exclusive tendencies in our understanding of the medieval period and what follows. Some scholars emphasize the continuities between the Middle Ages and the later time, now often called the early modern period. Others emphasize the ways in which 16th century writers, in some sense, created the Middle Ages in order to highlight what they saw as the brilliance of their own time. Medieval authors, of course, didn't think of themselves as living in the Middle Ages. They sometimes expressed the idea that the world was growing old and that there was a declining age, close to the end of time. Yet art, literature, and science flourished during the Middle Ages, rooted in the Christian culture and that preserved, transmitted, and transformed classical tradition. The works covered in this section of the anthology encompass a period of more than 800 years from Chalcedon's Haim at the end of the 7th century to Everyman at the beginning of the 16th century. The date 1485, the year of accession of Henry and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, is an arbitrary but convenient one to mark the end of the Middle Ages in England. Although the Roman Catholic Church provided continuity, the period was one of the enormous historical, social, and linguistic change. To emphasize these changes and the events underlying them, we have divided the period into three primary sections: Anglo Saxons literature, Anglo Norman literature, and Middle English literature in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Anglo Saxons invaders who began their conquest of the southeastern part of the Britain around 450 spoke an early form of the language we now call Old English. Old English displays its kinship with other Germanic languages much more clearly than does contemporary British and American English, of which Old English is the ancestors. As late as the 10th century, part of an Old Saxon poem written on the continent was transcribed and transliterated into the West Saxon dialect of Old English without presenting problems to its English readers. In form and content, Old English literature also has much in common with other Germanic literature, with which it shared a body of heroic as well as Christian stories. The major characters in Beowulf are pagan Danes and Geats, and only connection to England is an obscure allusion to the ancestors of one of the kings of the Angles. The changes already in progress in the language and culture of Anglo Saxon England were greatly accelerated by the Norman conquest of 1066. The ascendancy of a French speaking ruling class had the effect of adding a vast number of French loan words to the English vocabulary. The conquest resulted in new forms of political organization and administration, architecture, and literary expression. In the 12th century, through the interest of the Anglo Normans in British history before the Anglo Saxon conquest, not only England but all of the Western Europe became fascinated with a legendary hero named Arthur who makes his earliest appearance in Celtic literature. King Arthur and his knights became a staple subject of medieval French, English, and German literature. Selections from Latin, French, and Old Irish, as well as from early Middle English, has been included here to give a sense of the cross currents of language and literature in Anglo-Norman England and to provide background for later English literature in all periods. Literature in English was performed orally and written throughout the Middle Ages, but the awareness of the pride in a uniquely English literature does not actually exist before the late 14th century. In 1336, Edward III began a war to enforce his claims to the throne of France. The war continued intermittently for 100 years until finally the English were driven from all their French territories except for the port of Calais. One result of the war and these losses was a keener sense of the part England's nobility of their English heritage and identity. Toward the close of 14th century, English finally began to displace French as the language for conducting business in parliament and much official correspondence. Although the high nobility continued to speak French by preference, they were certainly bilingual, whereas some of the earlier Norman kings and had known no English at all. It was becoming possible to obtain patronage for literary achievement in English. The decision of Chaucer 1400 to emulate French and Italian poetry in his own vernacular is an indication of the change taking place in the status of English, and Chaucer's work were greatly to enhance the prestige of English as a vehicle for literature of high ambition. He was acclaimed by 15th century poets as the embellisher of the English tongue. Later writers called him the English Homer and father of English poetry. His friend Johann Gower, he was born 1330 and died in 1408, who wrote long poems in French and Latin before producing his last major works, the Confessio Amantis, the Lover's Confession, which in spite its Latin title is composed in English. The third and longest of the three primary sections Middle English literature in the 14th and 15th century is thus not only a chronological and linguistic division but implies a new sense of English as a literary medium that could compete with French and Latin in elegance and seriousness. Book production throughout the Middle Period was an expensive process until the invention of movable type in the mid 15th century, introduced into England by Caxton in 1476. Medieval books were reproduced by hand in manuscript, literally written by hand, while paper became increasingly common for less expensive manuscripts in the 15th century. Manuscripts were until then written on carefully prepared animal, usually calf or sheep, skin known as parchment or vellum. More expensive books could be illuminated both by colored and calligraphic lettering and by visual images. The institution of book reproduction developed across the period. In the Anglo Saxon period, monasteries were the main centers of book production and storage. Until their dissolution in the 1530s, the monastic and other religious houses continued to reproduce books, but from the early 14th century, particularly in London, commercial booking making enterprise came into being. These were loose organizations of various artisans such as parchmenters, scribes, flourishers, illuminators, and binders, who usually lived in the same neighborhoods in towns. A bookseller or dealer, usually a member of one of these trades, would coordinate the production of books to order for wealthy patrons, sometimes distributing the work of copying to different scribes who would be responsible for different gatherings or queries of the same book. Such shops could call upon the service of professional scribes working in the bureaucracies in the royal court. The market for books also changed across the period. While monasteries, other religious houses, and royal courts continued to fund the production of books from the Anglo Saxon period, books were also produced for and sometimes by noble and gentry households. From the 14th century, the market was widened yet further, with wealthy urban patrons also ordering books. Some of these books were dedicated to single works, some largely to single genres. Most were much miscellaneous, containing texts of many kinds and particularly in the Anglo-Norman period, written in different languages, especially Latin, French, and English. Only a small proportion of medieval books survive. Large numbers were destroyed at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Texts are in Old English, Early Middle English, the more difficult text in later Middle English. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Piers Below Man, and those in other languages are given in translation. Chaucer and other Middle English works may be read in the original, even by the beginner, with the help of marginal glosses and notes. These texts have been spelled in a way that is intended to aid the reader. Analysis of the sound and grammar of Middle English and of Old and Middle English prosody are presented. From the 1st to the 5th century, England was a province of the Roman Empire and was named Britannia after its Celtic speaking inhabitants. The Britons the Britons adapted themselves to Roman civilization, of which of the ruins survive to impress the poet of the Wanderer, who refers to them as the old works of Cairns. The withdrawal of the Roman legions during the 5th century in a vain attempt to protect Rome itself from the threat of Germanic conquest left the Iceland vulnerable to seafaring Germanic invaders. These belonged primarily to three related tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The English derives from the Angles and the name of the counties Essex, Sussex, and Wessex refers to the territories occupied by East, South, and the West Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon occupation was no sudden conquest but extended over decades of fighting against the native Britons.